When a reclusive stranger dies, no one in town is moved by his death. A loyal dog refuses to leave the man's grave, though, and its behavior sparks interest from a local police officer who unearths a mystery. When the cops open the man's grave, they are paralyzed by what they see. Yet again, the dog was lying on the grave. Officer Charles had seen the scruffy-looking animal most days now and couldn't understand why it was always lying there. Everyone in town knew the man who was buried there, or rather, they thought they knew him. The truth was, Paul Norton had been a stranger to everyone in town. Paul had lived in the town for as long as anyone could remember, but it was rare to see him around. He was always cooped up in his huge house by himself. Some people said he'd inherited money from his parents and never had to work a day in his life, while others said he'd been a ruthless businessman in his youth, stepping over everyone to get to the top. Rumors about Paul Norton had always existed, ever since the elusive stranger had bought the large mansion on the hill. The mansion was so much different from any other part of the town. This was a deprived area, and no one could understand why anyone with as much money as Paul would want to move there. Over time, people in the town came to resent him sitting in his mansion with all his money as he looked out over a struggling town. But no one knew the real Paul Norton. The day of Paul's funeral was cold and dark, snow threatened, and the clergymen that had to attend the funeral were secretly hoping it would be over quickly. No mourners gathered in the church, and no one stood at the graveside as Paul's coffin was lowered into the ground. In the last 50 years Paul had lived there. Only the oldest residents of the town could count on one hand the number of times the man had been seen outside of his home, and no one had any desire to be part of his final send-off. He'd never done anything for anyone else, after all. When Paul had first moved to the quiet town, everyone had been intrigued. The mansion had stood empty for a while, a relic of the town's once affluent past. Over the years, most of the factories that had once made it rich closed down. People lost their jobs, and the town's once wealthy past began to fade. Community spirit was what kept people going now. No one had a lot, but they helped each other out as much as they could. Now, Paul had moved into the mansion, and whispers began circulating that a billionaire had relocated to the town to help out with various community projects. As years went by, more and more stories about Paul Norton, the man in the mansion, circulated around town. People had once thought him to be a kind benefactor who had chosen to move there to help out a struggling community, but that clearly wasn't the case, as Paul had remained a stranger to everyone. Kids would tell ghost stories and dare each other to get as close to the mansion as possible. Adults became resentful of him. Why had a man with so much money moved to a struggling town and then ignored all the problems there? Now Paul was dead, and no one in town could say they felt moved by the loss. He'd never embraced the community spirit like everyone else in town, so as far as people were concerned, there would be nothing to miss. Officer Charles had lived in the town all his life. He'd once been one of the kids who dared to get close to the mansion, but in more recent years, he was the one telling teenagers not to trespass on the mansion grounds. He'd heard all the stories of Paul, but couldn't ever remember seeing the man himself. Still, it was curious that every day since the funeral, he'd seen the same dog lying by the grave. Another week passed by and the dog was still there. Officer Charles, who was an animal lover, was growing concerned about who was looking after the dog. If it spent all day and night by the grave, then it must be starving. Officer Charles decided to go and investigate. As he approached the dog, it let out a soft but sad whine. Did it belong to Paul? The officer reached into his pocket and pulled out some dog treats that he'd stopped by the shop to buy. The pup lifted its head and began to wag its tail. Charles spent the next 30 minutes befriending the dog. If he could gain its trust, maybe it would come with him, and he could get it cleaned up and give it a warm bed for the night. Charles tried to coax the dog towards his car, but it refused to move. It appeared that Paul had had one loyal friend in life after all. Every day, Charles visited the dog and fed it, and although it would happily accept the food and strokes, it never left Paul's grave. By now, the officer had told everyone he worked with about the dog. Everyone joked that the miserly old man didn't deserve such loyalty. But Charles couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the situation. On one of his regular visits to feed the dog, Charles got a surprise when it stood up and walked off in the direction of the mansion. Intrigued, he found himself following the dog. Soon, the pair were standing outside of the mansion's main entrance. Even though he knew it was wrong, curiosity got the better of him and Charles tried the front door. Unsurprisingly, it was locked. But now the thought was in his mind, he had to have just a quick glimpse inside. Paul had lived in the town for so long, and yet no one knew what the house looked like on the inside. Charles needed to know how many of the stories that had been invented about him were actually true. He made his way around the back of the house, trying several windows and doors along the way. He was about to give up when a small entrance at the back of the mansion opened up. Charles lingered in the doorway. Surely, one quick look around wouldn't hurt? He stepped inside. If Paul had been a billionaire, then beyond the size of the home he had lived in, there was no other evidence of an opulent lifestyle. The furniture was old and faded, and there was minimal furnishings. By an armchair was a stack of important-looking papers. Just one little look, Charles thought to himself. Then he would leave. When he got closer to the table, he noticed a small, old-looking photo in a frame. A beautiful young woman was hugging a young boy as they stood in a field of flowers. Charles didn't know why, but he felt sad looking at the photo. Paul had moved to the town alone, and he'd certainly been all by himself for the past 50 years. So who were the people in the photograph? Charles pushed the sad feeling to the back of his mind and focused on the task at hand. The papers turned out to be bank statements, and the officer couldn't believe the figures he was seeing. The more he looked, though, he began to notice an irregular pattern of payments all going to the same place. The sums of money going out were huge. Charles knew he needed to do more investigating. He took photos of the bank statements, then put them back where he'd found them and left. Charles enlisted the help of a trusted friend who he worked with. Without concrete evidence of anything, he could hardly go announcing to everyone at the police station that he'd broken into the mansion and looked through the dead man's bank statements. It didn't take long for his friend to work out that the money had been going to a local charity. The charity was a community-run project that helped people out with pretty much anything they needed assistance with, from medical bills to food parcels, and even just a friendly face and a listening ear. Had Paul been paying large amounts of money to charity all along? The man had lived in town for so long and never showed his face. He gained a reputation for being miserly and uncaring, but had everyone been wrong about him? Charles decided he needed to do a bit more digging. The payments were quite irregular and always for different amounts. It was time to ask the charity what had been going on. Charles wanted to believe that everything was okay, but he'd just discovered that now a dead man had been paying out huge amounts of money. While there was a chance that nothing bad had been going on, there could also be a case of blackmail and foul play, especially if someone at the charity had been aware of who was making the donations. Unfortunately, things were starting to look a bit suspicious. The charity's financial records weren't the most organized, and as such, no one could give Charles a proper answer. All anyone knew was that a mysterious benefactor had been donating large sums of money for as long as the charity had existed, which was almost 50 years now. It didn't take a genius to work out that in time, the charity had received millions from Paul Norton. But why? Without proper records, and with no one being able to answer any questions, Charles knew he had to take his suspicions to his superior. It was decided that although Paul had been very old when he died, the financial activity that Charles had discovered meant that foul play could no longer be ruled out. No one at the police station wanted to believe that the charity had done anything wrong, as everyone was aware of how much good they did. But as good police officers, they could not investigate. Paul's body would have to be exhumed for a postmortem. But the old man's grave was about to provide the police with so much more than just answers to a decades-long mystery. Knowing that the dog was still spending every day by Paul's grave, Charles wanted to be present when it was opened up so he could look after the poor animal. It was clear by now that the dog was the only companion Paul had had in this world and that it was clearly affected by the loss. The team arrived at the cemetery and sure enough the dog was lying by Paul's simple headstone. It took a few attempts, but Charles managed to coax the dog far enough away that the team could start digging. It didn't take long before the coffin was uncovered. The team lifted it out of the ground, and before Charles could react, the dog rushed over and began to paw and scratch at the wood. Everyone assumed that the poor animal just missed his master, but then Charles noticed the dog was scratching the same spot over and over again. He walked over to the coffin for a closer look and ran his hand along the place where the dog had been scratching. Something didn't feel right. Charles knocked on the wood and was greeted with a hollow sound. He began to pull at a piece of wood that was slightly raised up. He hoped that his suspicions were right, because if not, he was just destroying a dead man's coffin. With one final tug, the piece of wood came away from the coffin and everyone gasped. A secret compartment on the side of the coffin was revealed, and what was inside it left everyone paralyzed. Charles reached inside the compartment and pulled out 4 bags of money and a letter. The letter contained instructions for a trust fund that Paul had set up years ago, stating that the money would ensure continued support for all those in town that needed it. Beyond that, there was still no explanation for what Paul had done. Everyone had got him wrong, but they were about to find out who he really was. As part of the investigation, a team of officers had been sent to the mansion to recover anything that might help. They'd found stacks of diaries dating back to before Paul had even moved to the town, and ending just before he died. The pages of the diary revealed a life that no one had ever known. It was a tale of heartache and loneliness. Paul had chosen to move to the town after he'd lost his wife and son in a tragic car accident. He had been at work when the accident occurred. The diaries revealed that his wife had actually arranged for the whole family to spend the day together on a picnic, but Paul had been called in to deal with an emergency. He had spent his whole life blaming himself for the death of his son and wife. If he'd just taken the day off as planned, they would have lived. Hounded by grief, he'd left his whole life behind. He quit his job, already close to being a billionaire anyway, sold the family home, and moved to this town, where he locked himself inside his new house. Soon, he found it harder and harder to leave. He didn't want to meet new people and explain that his wife and child had died. He didn't want their pitying looks and their apologies because he didn't think he deserved them. His money was now useless to him, as no amount of wealth would ever bring back the 2 things that had been the most precious to him. But Paul had millions just sitting in his bank account. He had no desire to spend any of it on himself. That's when he'd started searching for ways he could help others. Paul had chosen to be an anonymous benefactor because he didn't want the attention that would come with donating such large amounts of money. What emerged from the diaries was a sad tale of a man who had locked himself away from a town that would have embraced him, if only he'd shared his pain with them. As news broke of Paul's real life, everyone around the town felt guilty for the misconceptions they'd held about the old man. They'd invented mean tales about him as children and grown into adults who resented him based on their own wrong beliefs. There was a collective sense that the man who'd made himself a stranger could have been a great friend to many. It was sad that Paul would never know that now. Charles was completely moved by the story. If it hadn't been for the dog, no one would have ever known the true Paul Norton, and he'd been a part of the problem. He'd never done anything before now to try and find out who the man really was. If he was being honest with himself, if the dog hadn't led him to the mansion, he probably would have never bothered to find out about Paul. Charles knew he needed to do something to give the man the send-off he deserved. Any foul play was quickly ruled out again, and the charity was allowed to benefit from Paul's trust fund just as he'd wanted. Charles knew he needed to act fast before Paul was reburied, so he headed down to the community hall, where the charity ran from. He spoke to many of the volunteers, who made it clear that, without the mystery donations provided by Paul, the charity wouldn't have been able to run for as long as it had. He met people who benefited from the work the charity did, and learned heartwarming tales that revealed the true impact that Paul had had on the town. One by one, people came forward with tales of unexpected kindness and generosity. There was the single mother who received a scholarship for her daughter's education, the struggling artist who found a studio space thanks to Paul's support, and the elderly couple who had been quietly assisted during their medical crises. Without Paul's generosity, none of this would have been possible. Charles told all the people he'd met about his plan, and everyone agreed that they wanted to be part of it. The day of Paul's reburial arrived, and before long, the graveyard was packed out. The vicar had agreed to do another service that was more fitting for the man they all now knew Paul to be. Hundreds of people turned up, as everyone who had been helped by Paul's money over the years wanted to say goodbye to the man who had given them a better life. At the front of the church, Officer Daniel stood with the dog that had sparked the investigation. There was no room for any more people inside the church, but still wanting to pay their respects, people gathered out in the graveyard with bunches of flowers and kind notes to leave on the grave. The letters told stories of how Paul had changed so many people's lives. This time, when Paul's coffin was lowered into the ground, it wasn't a lonely sight. Instead, a sea of people bowed their heads and said their thanks to a man whom they wished they'd known better. Paul Norton may have left the world quietly, but his legacy rang out loudly. Seemingly happy that his master had now had the send-off he deserved, the dog waited until everyone but Officer Charles had left the graveyard before sitting in front of the gravestone one last time. After a minute had passed, the dog went to stand by Charles. This time, when he turned to make his way home, the dog followed. Would you have made an effort to befriend Paul? Have you ever met a recluse? Tell us in the comments below. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.